So good to see you again, and today to talk about something that was a reader request. So we sent out a survey a while back to everybody who gets and reads our newsletter, and this is a topic that several people asked about, something that they wanted an article about, which is night feeds and when to drop them, how to drop them. Some people call that night weaning. Right? So meaning stopping the breastfeeding or the feeding at night. And because you are a specialist in a couple of those areas, including sleep and breastfeeding, thought you would be a great person to talk to about that. So to start with, would you just kind of explain what a night feed is? Like, what's the definition, or how would you describe that?
Sure. So babies and kiddos under a year really need to breastfeed between like 8 and 10 times a day on average in order to get in enough calories and nutrients that they need in a 24-hour period. And so some babies will, or older babies too, will nurse throughout the night as a way to ensure that they're getting enough calories. So I would consider night anytime after you go to sleep for the night. So any time that the baby is waking you up in the middle of the night. That might be one feed. It could be 3 feeds. Every kiddo is different, but that's kind of what I would consider night feeds to be.
Okay. And the number of feedings, you said 8 to 10 for kids who are breastfeeding who are under a year old. Is that different for formula fed babies?
So our goal is that we really want to ensure that they're getting in at least 24 to 30 ounces total in a 24-hour period in order to grow and gain weight well. And with formula, I do think that is a little different. And so it could be that formula-fed babies are likely eating larger volumes per feed to get in that same amount that's necessary for their growth and development. So I do think that formula-fed babies and breastfed babies do eat differently in that way.
And from what I understand, breast milk digests more quickly than formula. Is that right?
Yeah. And the babies eat less of it per feed. So breastfed babies will eat anywhere from 2 to 4 ounces total per feed on average, whereas formula fed kiddos tend to eat these larger volumes. Okay.
So it could be different there as far as the need for night feeds. And so you said, so are night feeds really necessary? And for how long are they necessary? If the goal is just to get in a certain number of calories, ounces per day.
Yeah. And this is where I think it's really baby dependent, and why I think it's one of the many benefits of breastfeeding is that the baby really gets to kind of run the show in that way, that they're kind of letting us know what they need versus us assuming we know what they need. Breastfed babies some of them will go long stretches overnight without needing to nurse and are still growing and gaining weight well, while as other kiddos really do need those extra feeds at night. So I think every baby's different in that way.
Okay. What accounts for those differences, do you think? Is it just metabolism, the amount they're getting, the kind of milk they're getting, all of the above?
Yeah, I think there's too many moving parts to really lock down an exact reason. But I think, some babies really need to wake more just because the arousal part of their brain is helping, to protect them from SIDS, or it could be that they just need more feeds. Maybe I think too, if we go back to work, sometimes being separate from you all day, and I acknowledge that this is necessary for a lot of families, but just the reality is that sometimes they want to nurse just for that closeness and connection that they're missing throughout the day. And so it could even just be that component. It could be, that they take in smaller amounts per feed. So it could be our milk volume in combination with, the baby's ability to transfer a certain amount of milk. I think there's a lot of moving parts here to that question.
Okay. And so is there kind of an average age when they maybe stop needing to eat at night for their nutrition? Or how would you determine with your own baby?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think anything 6, 7, 8, like 8, 9 months and older, maybe we could start really moving away from night feeds. But honestly, anything under a year, I would just really be still following the baby's lead in that way. So I think anything older than a year, I think it would be okay to start really considering night weaning if that's something that you feel like you want to do. But anything under a year, I would just kind of gauge, like, is the baby growing well? Are we seeing lots of wet and dirty diapers? Have we started the introduction of solids? All of these things would kind of sway my response to that.
And if the baby's growing well, gaining weight, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you most definitely can experiment with that. Yes. And then as we take away the night feeds, that feed will need to be replaced somewhere else. So as long as we're kind of ensuring that, okay, we did add in an extra feed during the day, or the baby did that naturally. And so then we can kind of start moving away. Because again, as long as the baby's getting in that amount of feeds per 24 hours, then we can kind of play with that nighttime.
Okay. And when you say night weaning, you don't necessarily mean cutting it off completely, right? So that's kind of how I felt with the night weaning. I thought, oh, well, I have to wait until I'm ready to just stop breastfeeding to remove these night feeds, but that's not right. Right? I wish I'd known this back then, I could have just minimized them. Like, instead of having to wake up 3 times, I could just wake up 1 time. Like, we could, because the older they get, we can look, like what you said, we can look at how they're growing, how they're eating during the day, and then decide, like, okay, they probably don't need 3 times at night. They might only need 2 times or 1 time.
I love that. I love that you acknowledge that, because I also felt the same. I felt like, oh, I can't night wean because then I really need to be prepared to kind of, I would assume that the baby would then not want to breastfeed at all after that, but that couldn't be further from the truth. So I love that acknowledgement that there is a way to wean babies at night while still protecting that breastfeeding relationship during the day.
Okay. Do you have any special recommendations or tips for how to start weaning? Like, even if, you're going to continue breastfeeding, but you just want to wake up less in the middle of the night to do it. Like,
yeah.
Any tips for helping the babies with that, for helping you with that?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. Kind of adding in some other objects, like as comfort for the baby, and other physical things that we do to help soothe them. So when you're breastfeeding or at night, when you're laying down with the baby, I would just kind of pat them, pat their little butt, or like rub their back, whatever feels good to you and baby. But just any type of like comfort measures that we can use that isn't the breast. Sometimes babies are doing what we call comfort seeking, where they just really want to be close to you. They want that closeness and connection. And we can meet that in other ways other than the breast. So if we're cuddling them and we're skin to skin with them and we're rubbing their back, they start to associate that with, like, comfort and soothing. And so then when we start taking away the breast, we can use those comfort measures as a way to still meet their needs. Adding in any lovey objects would do the same. So every time you breastfeed or at night when you're putting the baby to sleep, pull in this stuffed animal or a special blanket. And so then they start to associate that blanket with that closeness, connection, and comfort that they are also getting from the breast. So then when we start to take away the breast, then we just pull in those objects. So they're still associating that with that comfort. I think another big thing to consider is, especially for older kiddos, as we start inching closer to a year, that any big adjustment or transition away from something that they're used to is often met with resistance. So the baby is going to be upset about this change, but if you are solid in your thoughts around this and you're confident you are ready to kind of get rid of a night feed, it's really important to kind of be okay with their discomfort. So if they're crying or upset, that's normal. And I think sometimes we worry about weaning because we don't want to make them upset. But I think it's really only going to last for a few days. And then once they see that you're still meeting all their needs, you're still holding them, you're still caring for them, you're still supporting them through that emotion, then they start to be okay with just the cuddles versus the nursing and cuddles. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And so would you recommend, because, I know for me, breastfeeding did turn into a way to help them sleep, right? They even became dependent on breastfeeding for sleep at some points. But then I usually had at least one other thing that would work. If I really needed them to go to sleep, some tried and true things. Like for some people, it might be the car seat. That was not true for my children, but putting them in the little baby carrier and walking around or bouncing a little bit. Or for some kids, it might be sitting in a rocking chair and rocking, or like you said, rubbing their bottom or snuggling, or so for some, it's walking in a stroller, things like that. And so would you recommend using any of those things when you're trying to make that transition away from a night feed, just to help them sleep without it?
Yeah, and I think it really does depend on their age and your feelings around that. Like, do we want to put the baby in a stroller and go for a walk every night when we're putting them to bed? Maybe we do. Maybe that is something that we want to make as part of our routine. But if that isn't something that you feel like is sustainable long-term, then I would just kind of evaluate that. But I think every family works so differently. But I think any of those comfort measures are totally fine to use as long as we feel like we're okay with also doing that thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Or it could maybe be transitional, just for like the hardest part.
Yeah.
The things we do when we're desperate to get a little sleep and we're trying to do something like this, right?
Yeah. And that's true especially for the little ones. I guess I'm thinking more about like the older kiddos.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
I also heard you mention when we were talking earlier about roping in partners, or to have a helper that could be there with you when you're trying to maybe take away a night feed, that might make it a little easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I really do strongly encourage this, even when they're little, honestly, is really our partners are going to be able to comfort and soothe babies in a different way than we do, especially if we're using the breast as a way to help the baby go to sleep or to comfort and soothe them. Our partners aren't doing that, right? But they are finding their own way to help calm and soothe the baby. So really from birth, like your partner really being an active participant in helping to calm and soothe the baby will benefit you and behoove you later when you're trying to start weaning from the breast overnight, because your partner can kind of take over at night and really ensure that he's using or they're using their comfort measures to help get the baby to sleep. And so I think some time or a period away where like maybe partner does bedtime every night, and then when baby no longer is requesting the breast, then we know that you can kind of come back in. So maybe it won't be forever, like especially if nighttime is special to you. Like I definitely don't want to take that away. But I think having partner kind of take over bedtime for a while can really help the baby to no longer feel like they need that to go to sleep. So then when you're kind of roped back in, then you can just cuddle baby to sleep or use whatever partner's comfort measures have been.
Okay. So what about some things like, I know that, so we've kind of been back and forth, kind of bouncing around with this, but this idea that babies get overly attached or overly dependent on the breast for sleep or for feedings with sleep, even a bottle. And that's, it could be a problem. It's not necessarily a problem, but especially if you're wanting to sleep more in longer stretches, then it could be, right? It could become a problem. And if that's the only way your baby will go back to sleep, like you said, if you don't have other comfort measures that you can use, that can make it really hard. So aside from like helping them by having other associations with that comfort, are there any other ways to just kind of slowly back off of that, or to help your baby learn to fall asleep without a nipple in their mouth. Besides doing something else like getting up and bouncing them, walking them, rocking them, things like that. Like, can you shorten the feedings or pull the nipple out of their mouth before they fully fall asleep? Like, do those things work? When would be the best time to start like trying some of those things?
Yeah, I think it's always a matter of you kind of assessing how you feel about what you're doing. And so it's like, if you nurse the baby to sleep every night and are okay with that, then maybe it's not a problem. But if you feel you're starting to feel like, okay, like I really feel like I need some extra sleep, like it's starting to really impact me, then please, like, of course, let's practice some of those things. Like, that's when we know that it's time to make a transition, right? But I love the idea too of like, yeah, I love pulling the breast out of the baby's mouth or the kiddo's mouth before they completely fall asleep. I think that can be helpful. And then again, adding in your comfort measures, rubbing their back or kind of patting them in addition to that breastfeeding. And so then that way, when you pull the breast out of the mouth and you continue patting them, maybe they don't look for the breast because they're being comforted in another way. Skin to skin, I think, is also helpful for that. Feeding for shorter durations is definitely helpful for that. Some kiddos will let you, like, I used to sing a song to the baby and it would be like, by the time we're done with this song, and it might be something as simple as like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and then when we're done with the song, it's time to put the breast away. And depending on the kiddo's age too, you could even just say like, the breasts are sleeping, like it's time for sleep, we can cuddle, we can still be together, but the breasts are asleep. And I think all these things are helpful.
Okay. I don't know that I have any other questions, actually. I think you've kind of covered it. I think that one of the biggest things that for me is so eye-opening about this conversation, as far as just how I felt when I was night parenting a baby, and now, which, I have teenagers, so obviously I haven't done that in a really long time, but I can really remember that time and what it felt like. And there was this idea in my head that if I stop breastfeeding at night, that means I have to stop breastfeeding. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people feel that way. And so really important to understand it's not one or the other. Like, you can do both. You can breastfeed and not breastfeed at night or breastfeed less at night.
Yeah.
And even if you're bottle feeding, it's the same thing, right? It's still hard to get up in the middle of the night and prepare that bottle and hold the baby until they finished and hold the bottle and, do that whole thing. And so whether you're breastfeeding or bottle feeding, it can definitely get to a point where it feels hard. And sometimes then it starts to feel too hard to do that in the middle of the night so much. So
yeah, I think that's kind of when you have to really check in with yourself, is like, is what you're doing working for you? Like, do you know that it's normal for babies to wake? And so you just latch the baby on and go right back to sleep, and it doesn't feel like it's a problem for you? Great. Well, then keep doing what you're doing. I think there's this misconception about what's normal for babies and how long they should be sleeping, when in reality is that we're all vastly different from one another, babies included. And there isn't just like one right way to do this. But I think when you're starting to feel like, okay, this isn't working for me anymore, that's when it's time to make a change. But it does take you kind of figuring out what you actually feel about it before I would encourage making that decision.
And as a lactation consultant, do you get this question a lot? Is this something you feel like you can really help families with on an individual level when you do like a individual consultation?
Absolutely. That would be my preferred method, mostly because every family is so unique. Every baby is so unique. Every baby's sleep needs are different from one another. Some babies only sleep short durations, some sleep longer durations, and both of those things are normal. And I feel like I would never make completely blanket statements, because I would just need to know more about each individual family, what their needs are, what their goals are. So individual would definitely be the preferred way. Yes.
Okay. And who wouldn't want to come spend an hour with Cassie? Okay. That's all for me. Thank you. Thank you so much for going over this.